I have Pastor David Averill with us for our Barefoot podcast this week. Pastor David, in addition to being the lead pastor here at our church, he also serves as a National Guard chaplain. He frequently leads seminars for new couples, families, and single people. So, Pastor David, how are you today?
Dylan, I'm doing fantastic, and it's great to be here in the youth basement.
Yes. In the basement, this aroma of all of the activities that happen on
nine square.
Yes. So what we'll do today on this podcast is we'll be talking about our new series coming up, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and Highly Effective Families. So there are a few pieces to this next series that'll be available for you as a parent, as a family member, as someone interested in just bettering yourself. We will have this available over the next several weeks that'll be led by Pastor David. So as we kind of get into these questions, this will just give you an insight into Pastor David and what we'll be discussing over this series. So David, share with me some of your experiences in the church and the military working with young people and families.
Right. So as you were mentioning, Dylan, we are doing this study on Wednesday nights during Barefoot, so parents can come at the same time their young people or are in Barefoot, or perhaps you have younger ones that are in footprints, and so they can show up. And upstairs here above the youth basement is our friendship hall, so we'll be having this study on 7 habits. So even though we started this past week, you're still welcome to join. It'll last about an hour 15 minutes, and you'll get a free book on the 7 habits. I've led this 7 habit study many times in the military, and Stephen Covey is an organization that is a large corporation that contracts with many Fortune 500 companies, the military, many nonprofits to do the 7 habits training. And in my experience, I was a youth leader like you. We've talked about, being a youth pastor.
Yes.
And we were even at different times youth pastors in a similar location. In the central Savannah River area. Like Evans, Augusta, Aiken, South Carolina. We really connected on that. And as you know, it's not, when you're a youth director, a youth minister, you're not only ministering to the young people, you're also ministering to their families as well. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, it's such an important part that I learned later on in the journey. Everybody tends to think as you start out that you focus on the students and what we're doing, the activities, and but parent ministry and then encompassing family ministry is an important part of youth ministry, because
right.
If you connect with the parents and you build that relationship, it unlocks a lot of new opportunities for ministry, because the whole family's involved. You're trusted in the family, and there's just opportunities for you to grow with the entire group. So
yeah, and I would tell you that earlier on, I wish I had known about the 7 habits, and this book. I mean, it's been around for 30 or more years. Stephen Covey was a BYU Brigham Young University business professor, took a lot of research and look at ancient philosophy, religion, especially Christianity. It was a member of the LDS Church, Latter-day Saints, so it's different than mainstream Christianity, but nonetheless, the similarities that are there and the family values, he encompassed that in this work, the 7 habits, which he intended for business leaders in the business arena, but really found out that it would be applicable in all walks of life. So I've done this training with single people, with young people, with older people. In another church, we did this sermon series, and everybody said this was some of the best content that they had received, and it helped them see the Bible in a new light and their Christian faith in a new light. So that's why I'm really excited to do this here at First United Methodist Church in Mount Dora.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the 7 habits of highly effective families is one of the best book training programs that you've led. So why the 7 habits?
Well, the seven habits are based on certain, self-evident values that Covey took a look at cultures all around the world and ancient philosophy, and he found out that a lot of people in our modern day world focus a lot on techniques and tactics. If I can only improve myself externally, if I was only a better speaker, if I only made more money, if I could only, an example of this would be a book that was famous in the early 1920s. It was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Mm-hmm. And it focused on externally how you could do those things. Well, Covey found out that the most successful people throughout history have had something within them at the center, and that was character. And character, as the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle said, is something that you repeatedly do. Your habits are something that you repeatedly do, and they're cultivated over time with self-mastery. And then once you've mastered yourself, then it's leading others toward that same mastery. And that's really what Jesus did as a teacher with his disciples. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's very applicable to the Christian faith and what Jesus was trying to do, especially like on the Sermon on the Mount. So these values are universal and self-evident. So that's why I think they're so helpful, because they can apply across all ages, all aspects of life, and across, from generation to generation. Even though this book is 30 years old, people still use it, feel it's relevant, and are excited about it when they do the training.
Yeah, and so this information will be good for any walk of life that wants to,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we're doing here is,
so just because
8 to 88. Yeah.
Right.
And we had some folks who were grandparents or aunts and uncles who were in our study last night, and they still found it to be very helpful, and they provided their own unique perspective in the book study. And so I think that's why this is so successful, is that anybody 8 to 88 can find something of value in this, because it applies to universal values that God puts and reveals to us through the Bible and through Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And so you talked about the 7 habits as a paradigm and framework for life. What does that have to do with following Jesus, though? How do those things tie in?
Yeah, how it has to do with following Jesus is, first of all, we talk a lot about in the Christian faith about, learning to trust in Jesus, giving our life over to Jesus. I've accepted Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior, that I have a need of God in my life. But there's more to it than that. We're not just saved from sin and death for eternal life, but we're also saved for a purpose in this life.
Right.
Even though we're only given one life to live, and it's not going to be long, God still has a definite purpose in our life to glorify Him in this life. And part of how we can glorify Him is, Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. And the meaning that Jesus wanted us to bear fruit, and fruit that will last. And fruit means to make a difference in this world. Everybody can make a difference. And so I think that's what the 7 habits help give a pathway toward being a fruitful person in the way that Jesus would want us to do, making a difference in others' lives, loving God and loving neighbor, as we say here at First Mount Dora. So that's why I think this has to do with following Jesus. It gives a pathway to not only accept Jesus as personal Lord and Savior, but to walk with Him every step of the way, every day, whether in home, school, church, or a workplace, wherever we go. So it gives us a definite plan on how to do better and bear more fruit in those places.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense. Jesus wants to grow and bear fruit, and so I can see how the 7 habits, kind of give that roadmap, that roadmap to bear fruit in life. So I can see that correlation there. And so obviously, with this being a podcast, we don't have as much time as you would during the time and community you have together when you're here for the actual in-person class. But I did want to touch on one of the first habits, or the first habit, and that's to be proactive. And so what does that mean?
Well, being proactive means to take responsibility for your own personal choices. There's a lot of things in life that we cannot control, but the one thing that we can control, especially, is our mind and our heart. That God gives that to us, and no one can take us away. No one can take that away. as Jesus even said in the Sermon on the Mount, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Meaning Jesus was saying, if you do have freedom even when people try to take it away. So sometimes we get in the trap with our thinking that the problem is always out there. Somebody is out there to get me. The teacher stinks, and so I'm not learning. That's why I'm failing this class.
That's what I used all the time. Teacher stinks.
Yeah, the teacher stinks. That's why I'm failing. But the idea in being proactive is to say responsibility is saying, yes, maybe the teacher isn't the best teacher, but I'm going to take responsibility for my learning and go get tutoring from somebody who can help me. If this teacher can't help me figure this out, there was a time when I failed a chemistry course in college, and I didn't take responsibility for it. I said, well, that teaching is just poor, and whatever, I quit, I'm done. And that wasn't being proactive, that was being reactive. So the idea of what I could have done better, and I realized in future courses, there was one time where I was taking a graduate course, and I didn't like the teacher, but I got with that teacher and said, what can I do to help pass this course? And we talked about it, we talked about ways I can manage my time, and I didn't walk away with an A, I walked away with a C, but I was more proactive and took responsibility and did the things that I needed to do, and ultimately it helped me get that degree, and that's what mattered in the long run. It wasn't mattered what the specific grade was, but that I passed the course, and then I took ownership and responsibility to do what I could do. I couldn't control that teacher, that person's standards, their perspective, what they thought about me, but I could control the things that I could control. I took responsibility for, and that's really what being proactive is about.
Yes. In this book, Covey talks about Viktor Frankl.
Yes, Viktor Frankl. Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, if you would.
Some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Viktor Frankl was a psychologist in the 1930s and a professor in Vienna. And Vienna was famous for a lot emerging psychology. Freud was a famous psychologist in the early 1900s and so Viktor Frankl was in that Freudian school. He was also Jewish, and during the 1930s and 40s, as many know, there was extreme anti-Semitism in Germany and in Austria and in other republics that the Nazi Germany took over, and the Nazis promoted anti-Semitism and scapegoated Jewish people. The Holocaust was a horrific event in human history, led to the death of 6 million Jewish people. And Frankl was actually in a death camp. He lost several of his relatives there, a Nazi death camp. But he made some observations while he was there. And what he felt was that the one thing that he noticed, and he writes about this in greater detail in a book called Man's Search for Meaning, is that the one piece of real estate and that no one can take away, and yet you can't lose freedom in, is your mind. If you don't want to give up your mind to somebody else, you don't have to. That the thoughts that you think, you have freedom in there. And so he would practice certain visualization techniques there that would help him feel more positive about the environment. He wouldn't accept the environment, but if he would visualize him teaching in the academy, things that he loved doing in difficult times, and that would give him hope to get out of that situation. And one of the things that he said in this book that Covey cites is that between stimulus and response, there is a choice. And in that choice, there lies freedom and someone's destiny. So, in other words, there's a lot of things in this world that happen to us that we cannot control. But there are things that we can control, and if we focus on the things we can control, we push out the negativity of the things that we can't control. And so we focus on the freedom like the God gives to worship, to praise, to be grateful for the things that we have. We're focusing less on the things we don't have or the things that are getting us down. Mm-hmm. So it's similar to what we talk about in Christianity of praying and asking God for help, and also finding ways to be grateful to God for what we have. I'm grateful, God, that there's a beautiful sun outside, the sun is shining, instead of saying, God, I'm so angry about this teacher, about my parents, or whatever it might be.
Right.
So it's focusing on a lot more about what we can control rather than things that we can't.
What biblical story do you think we can learn from about being proactive?
Yeah, so Joseph in Genesis, and Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob was one of the patriarchs. Patriarchs is a big word that means fathers.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot in the Bible about families, but as someone asked me last night at our study, like, Pastor David, but why don't we talk about parenting from a biblical perspective, or being a son or a daughter from a biblical perspective? And the answer in reality is that there's a lot of family dysfunction in the Bible. And among these, in Genesis, you have 3 generations that are discussed in history, in the beginning of recorded history: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's also some dysfunction among these families. And even in the midst of that dysfunction, God still works through these families. So Joseph was one of these 12 sons, and his father Jacob did what a good father normally would. He played favorites with his children.
Right.
And Joseph was the favorite. You know the story. What happened when he got, what was one sign that he was the favorite son of Jacob?
Getting the coat, of course.
The coat of many colors,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The coat of many colors. And the other brothers were jealous, and Joseph even had a dream. He had a gift of interpreting dreams. Well, he told his brothers that he would rule over them, and even though this would later come true, they were none too happy. So they sold him into slavery, and in Egypt. And then he went to Egypt. He got into a household, rose up the ranks, and then got someone else there didn't like him, which was the wife of his master, Potiphar. Well, he got back thrown in jail. So in both of those experiences, losing his freedom to slavery and to jail, he easily could have given up. But he didn't give up. He was proactive. He said, I can't control those things, but there are things that I can control. So in jail, he used his gift of interpreting dreams, and others caught wind of that, and eventually the Pharaoh had a deeply distressing dream, and Joseph, interpreted that dream and earned Pharaoh's trust and rose up second command of all of Egypt. And finally, during this famine, because Joseph was a good administrator and helped prepare the whole kingdom and had foresight and vision and was proactive, he led Egypt to have plenty of food. So Joseph's brothers, who were in Canaan, came from Canaan into Egypt. Were looking for food because they knew Egypt had food. And Joseph recognized his brothers. They didn't recognize him, but finally he revealed himself to his brothers. And there's a long story about this in Genesis, in the end of Genesis, first book in the Bible. And he finally said, what you have intended for malice or evil, God has made good. And instead of blaming God, blaming his brothers, he looked to God in his time of help, whether he was in slavery or whether he was in jail, and God redeemed him. And part of it was also Joseph's ability to focus on foresight in the future and having hope and vision. So I think Joseph is a great example of what it means to be proactive and taking personal responsibility for the things you can't control rather than things that you can. Instead of blaming other people for your circumstances, what can I do personally, and what can I control to make my circumstances better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I never thought of that story in that way. You get the one direction, the perseverance more, with Joseph, but to think about it that way is a good application. So to wrap things up, we're going to just kind of touch on how we can apply, so the application to tie it all together, how we can apply being proactive in our own lives, because that's the golden question, right?
Yeah,
That's
how
the
do you do that?
million-dollar question.
And I would say just briefly, there's a circle of concern and a circle of control. That's what's talked about in the book here. And the circle of concern are things outside of our control that oppress us, that make us feel bad, that teacher we don't like at school, the bully at school, the not trying out for the team and practicing as much as we can, not making the team that we wanted at school. There are things that are outside of our control, but instead of focusing on the negative things, focus on the things that we can control. Maybe we won't make the team, but let's be positive and do everything that we can do to try to make the team. So continue to practice our sport or our hobby to try and make the team. Continue to try and study and crack a book and do our homework, even if we're going to get a C or a D. If we apply ourselves, at least we'll pass the course. And going into the teacher's hours or after school, asking the teacher, what can I do? Can I get extra credit? Taking responsibility for what we can do, even if there's a negative experience, and feeling better about ourselves and more control of our circumstances. The same applies for parents as well, who may be listening to this podcast. I understand that some of our parents listen as well.
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
They do, yeah. So, Pastor David, I want to thank you for sharing today.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
And we're going to, over the next 10 weeks, we're going to continue this conversation, not only in the podcast, but also upstairs on Wednesday nights. So if you would like to join us for that, we would love to have you. I know Pastor David would love to have you, and just be in community to go over these things and get different perspectives, I think is the important piece. I mean,
yeah, and
it's just,
I think it's so important. I hope you will share this podcast or this video with your friends. We're going to put it out there, and also tell them about Sunday. We're going to have this sermon series in church on Sundays.
yes.
So it's another place in worship that you may be able to come to get it. And of course, our worship services are also posted to YouTube and Facebook and our website at mountdora.fumc.org.
So just a little preview for next week. We'll be discussing Habit 2,
Right.
which is...
Habit number 2 is keep the end in mind. So we're going to focus a little bit on how having a vision for the future and developing a personal mission statement or a family mission statement can really help you stay committed to a particular goal in life. And when adversity comes, you can be resilient and continue to focus on that long-term goal.
Well, there you go.
Yes.
Great. We'll look forward to discussing that next week. And again, thank you, Pastor David, and thank you for all of you. Thank you to all of you who are listening and or watching. And we hope to see you here at First Methodist Mount Dora very soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. There we go.